Today we're talking all about a Spider-Man villain who's a bit more esoteric and lesser known than many of the other Spider-Man villains out there, and yet much more flamboyant. Yes, today we're talking all about Hypno-Hustler. Created by Bill Mantlo and Frank Springer for 1978's Spectacular Spider-Man issue 24, Hypno-Hustler is one of Spider-Man's odder, unique villains, and yet, through it all, has seemingly broken through the constraints put on him by the period-specific relevancy of his gimmick, as this video comes on the heels of the announcement that Hypno-Hustler is getting the big screen treatment. Back in the 1970s, Bill Mantlo had been working on fill-in issues and then the black and white Deadly Hands of Kung Fu magazine-sized series with people like George Perez and Keith Giffen. When that was canceled, Mantlo got assigned to Iron Man and Peter Parker's Spectacular Spider-Man. At the beginning, Spectacular was still plotted by Archie Goodwin, so all Mantlo was doing was captions and dialogue for a few issues. By this time, Mantlo had become prolific in Marvel Comics, having already created a slew of new characters like Rocket Raccoon, Jack of Hearts, and White Tiger. So when Jim Shooter came in looking to see who could make new characters, he took Mantlo off of Iron Man and kept him on Spectacular. And now, with plotting ability, Mantlo found himself tied into America's zeitgeist, and the disco-themed Hypno-Hustler was born. Imagine Jimi Hendrix and John Travolta all rolled into one. That's cool because both Hendrix and Donald Glover have used the This Is America name in their discography. Hendrix would sometimes call his anthem renditions This Is America, as he did at Woodstock in 1969. 50 years later, in 2019, Glover, aka Childish Gambino, won a Grammy for a song with that same name. And that comparison will make more sense in a moment. Hypno-Hustler's first appearance is dubbed Saturday Night Spider-Man, an obvious play on John Travolta's Saturday Night Fever, which had come out just the year before. In fact, the logo on the splash page in that issue mimics that of the film's logo. This was a couple years before DeFalco and Romita Jr., at the direction of both Marvel Comics and Casablanca Records, created a character named Dazzler, aka the Disco Dazzler, aka the Disco Queen, for 1980's Uncanny X-Men, issue 130. For Dazzler's own book, Frank Springer jumped on the creative team after JR left. Marvel was so on board with this idea, even though in hindsight were the waning days of disco's popularity, that a Gary Goddard Dazzler movie starring Bo Derek was in the works, but that got canned for a couple different reasons, and when disco faded out of popularity after the disco demolition at Comiskey Park, so too did disco-themed characters. But disco wasn't dead. Disco went underground, evolved into house music at underground clubs and raves, while Antoine himself would go to ground for quite a few years. So, what is his story? Antoine Delsoin was born in Corona Park in Queens, New York. Growing up, he'd frequently had problems with truancy, and it led to him dropping out of high school. At some point, he developed hypnotic powers while cultivating his affinity for music and his abilities as a musician. Antoine comes decked out with his groovy purple or pink and white colorway, his electric guitar, these special goggles that can induce a hypnotic trance, a belt that can discharge an electrical blast, headphones to protect himself from his own power, and boots that come with 4 3-inch retractable blades in the soles, and even the ability to dispense halothane, an airborne anesthetic gas. With the Mercy Killers as his backup singers, his hypnotic powers were amplified even more. That is, until he got an upgrade and they were no longer needed. Antoine made no effort to make his villain identity secret. In fact, he's billed as the Hypno-Hustler in publicity and even advertises as such on his posters around New York City. In issue 30, a guy named Beppe Sabatini wrote into the Marvel's letter page about Hypno-Hustler. Sabatini, it turns out, is credited with comic work at the distinguished competition, DC Comics, on Action Comics, Superman, New Talent Showcase, as well as Alien Encounters with Eclipse in the mid-1980s. Sabatini was complaining. The derivation of the word disco, he says, comes from the fact that establishments play flat vinyl discs called phonographs, and not, in his words, live bands. He also said that to be heard at a distance, an electric guitar needs to be plugged in to an amp and a speaker, but Hypno-Hustler's wasn't. He continues to complain about the character in the issue. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on this character and if you agree with Sabatini or not. In Peter Parker's Spectacular Spider-Man issue 24, Peter Parker had made it onto the subway back to his apartment in Queens, passing by those very same posters that I referenced earlier. Peter was discouraged about not having passed his semester at school due to 1 credit missing, and thinking about how he'd have to study through summer. Funny enough, this was commented on in the letter section of Spectacular Spider-Man issue 30, where it said that this was an error. Bill Mantlo on Spectacular and Marv Wolfman on Amazing Spider-Man both knew that Parker wouldn't graduate. Marvel didn't know which credit, and so Bill assumed it would be an academic credit, and that's why he had Parker wanting to stay up all night studying. So Mantlo was rather surprised when Marv Wolfman decided that it would be gym class that Peter Parker failed. It was too late to correct at that point because Spectacular Spider-Man issue 24 was already at the printers. When Parker got home, his friends Harry Osborn, Liz Allen, Holly Gillis, Betty Brant, Flash Thompson, and Flash's girlfriend, Shashan Nguyen, aka Sister's son, were there to surprise him and cheer him up, calling it his ungraduation party. They told the bookworm Peter Parker that they had a table reserved at the Beyond Forever disco. Harry and Flash pulled Parker into another room to put on his white John Travolta suit, and as noted in issue 30 as another error, neither of his friends noticed or commented on the Spider-Man suit that he certainly had under his disco attire. So anyhow, at the disco that night, they ordered 6 Cokes and a Pepsi Light. That's not important to the story, but there you go. Maybe in other circles that would be just to wash down their quaaludes. Peter ran into Mary Jane as well, and that's when we cut scenes from the dance floor to the back room. And this is where we meet Mr. H.H., the Hypno-Hustler. Before the show, before Antoine was scheduled to take the stage for his gig, Antoine broke into the safe in the backstage manager's office of stage manager Bernie and was in the process of stealing Bernie's money. Bernie caught Antoine in the act and was angry, especially after paying for Antoine's expenses and his publicity. And so Antoine used his hypnotic powers and a song called Blood from a Stone to knock Bernie out. Antoine told him, "I want everything. I want it all. And as the Hypno-Hustler, I have the power to take it." Antoine then convinced a backup vocal band of 3 ladies named the Mercy Killers to play the gig with him. When they began playing, Antoine said it was disco magic. The soothing sibilance of the Mercy Killers perfectly complemented Antoine's mind-numbing hypnotic abilities, and so, even as Parker and Betty Brant danced on the dance floor, the Hypno-Hustler and his Mercy Killers took to the stage. And as the show continued on, Antoine and the band hypnotized the audience, and he had them under his thrall. Parker said he hadn't felt anything like that since his encounter with Mindworm in Amazing Spider-Man issue 138. Parker fell to the ground, changed to his Spider-Man costume, and managed to spin some earplugs up with his webbing, protecting himself from the siren song of the Mercy Killers and the Hypno-Hustler. Hypno-Hustler and the Mercy Killers played a song called Sweet Surrender until Spider-Man leapt right at the Hustler. Spider-Man and Hypno-Hustler fought, with Spider-Man ripping Antoine's own headphones off his head, making him susceptible to his own sound. And then he webbed the mouths of the Mercy Killers up, and now with all of them incapacitated, Spider-Man left them for authorities, dangling by spiderwebs from the disco ball above the dance floor at Beyond Forever. To continue the music theme, the next issue featured a villain named Carry On with the tagline, "Carry on, my wayward son." And he wouldn't be seen until Spider-Man's Tangled Web in 2002, many years later. In those issues, Hypno-Hustler was sent to a prison known as the Cage. While in prison, Antoine joined Tombstone's group along with Big Ben Donovan and Rocket Racer, a guy who would ultimately become one of Antoine's friends. Tombstone was in need of a heart bypass, and so Hypno-Hustler was part of his protection detail. They ended up attacking a rival gang led by Kangaroo, but then as revenge, Kangaroo and his men kicked the crap out of Tombstone's crew. And in prison, Antoine had met with Jackson Wheel, aka Big Wheel, who'd hired Rocket Racer to steal documents that would incriminate him for embezzlement. But then he'd gone to a support group called Villanon, or Villains Anonymous, in prison, and changed. So when Antoine ended up talking with Jackson Wheel, he was inspired too to change his ways. When he was paroled, Antoine decided to help Spider-Man fight crime. In Andrews and Villarubia's Reign continuity in 2006, with Spider-Man Reign issue 2, Antoine was now aged and with gray hair, now referring to himself as the Godfather of Funk. To redeem himself, he played his Hypno-Mix 86 tape to help bring down the Reign. But when the boombox turned off, the Reign fought back and Antoine was shot and he collapsed to the ground in a pool of his own blood. The next year, 2007, during the World War Hulk storyline, Uatu the Watcher told a tale of another alternate reality where Hulk crushed Hypno-Hustler's head with 2 fingers. He was then, the following year, a background character during House of M's House of M Avengers story. In 2009's Fing Fang 4 Return, Robot Electro was sent to prison, and there he met Antoine, who introduced himself as the Hypno-Hustler, the Disco Devil incarnate. This was the S-Wing of the prison reserved for Spider-Man villains, and Antoine said that the cool cats called S-Wing Swing. Antoine and the others all joined in on the inevitable prison break. In Amazing Spider-Man issue 645, which was part of the Origin of Species story arc, Hypno-Hustler burst into the NYPD's 10th precinct in Chelsea, New York, frantically asking for help as Spider-Man was on a rampage after Chameleon stole Menace's baby in a plot by Dr. Octopus. Right after he entered the police station, Spider-Man threw villains like Diablo, Overdrive, and the Spot in the door in a big ball of spiderwebs. Antoine asked for help and protection, and an officer said to hide Hypno-Hustler in clown college somewhere. Later, Antoine was back in prison. He was now sharing a cell with a guy named the Tinkerer. Antoine hypnotized Tinkerer to stop smoking, and to return the favor, Tinkerer upgraded Antoine's gear, which now gave him the ability to make illusions and which no longer required him to have his backup singers to amplify his powers. He also contacted Deadpool and convinced Wade Wilson, Deadpool, that he'd be able to help him die permanently. He gave Wade a transmitter, which Deadpool then attached to Spider-Man's mask. This hypnotized Spider-Man, and Antoine was then able to have Deadpool and Spider-Man break him out of prison. Deadpool protected Antoine while he used his power to unleash the rest of the inmates on the web-slinger. Spidey held his own, so he sent Deadpool after Spider-Man. Deadpool tricked Hypno-Hustler, making him think Spider-Man was now dead. He took off his hypnotic glasses to get a better look, and having taken the bait, opened himself up to attack, and the Hypno-Hustler was taken down once again. Hypno-Hustler then showed up at a dance school to pull the same stunt he'd done at Beyond Forever. But Hobgoblin showed up too, shut off the music, and the dance students then turned their ire toward the Hypno-Hustler and beat him down. He was then hanging out with his friend Rocket Racer as they talked about how Iron Fist and Luke Cage were getting the Heroes for Hire back together. And after that, he went to a funeral for Piranha Jones and gave a speech where he told the audience a story about how PJ had once helped him out. After that, he was at the villain bar called the Bar with No Name when Sabretooth and Iron Fist showed up to ask questions, and during that confrontation, Sabretooth kicked Antoine right in the face. This didn't deter him from going to supervillain hangouts though, as we see him later at a place called the Pop-Up with No Name. In 2022, Hypno-Hustler confronted Luke Cage and Misty Knight. Luke and Misty briefly bickered about who had more drip, then knocked Hypno-Hustler out with a pair of simultaneous, synchronized uppercuts. Recently, it was announced that Sony is developing a Hypno-Hustler feature film, both starring and produced by Donald Glover. Glover was a candidate for the role of Spider-Man that eventually went to Andrew Garfield, an event that inspired Brian Michael Bendis to create the character Miles Morales. Glover then got a cameo as Aaron Davis in Spider-Man Homecoming. In comics, Aaron Davis is a villain named the Prowler and also happens to be Miles Morales' uncle. Eddie Murphy's son, Miles Murphy, is writing the screenplay for the Hypno-Hustler project. And Glover was attracted to the musical part of this character's story, coupled with his limited time in canon, which means there are less constraints on what they can do with the character, story, and development-wise. And so you can see that Glover is tied both to Spider-Man lore and to the character itself. And about Spider-Man, Glover once said in an interview with MTV that he, quote, was really into comic books as a kid. I used to make comic books when I was in first grade and sell them for a penny. I got into trouble for it, actually. I was always really into Spider-Man. I love his backstory of feeling responsible for his uncle's death. So how will this turn out? We'll have to wait and see, which means that's a wrap on this one, my friends. I'm Jesse, this is JLS Comics, and I'll see you soon.